that extraordinarily gracious and kind introduction. I'm not going to live up to the hype of such an introduction, but hopefully I'll share some things that you might find interesting. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, the Q&A period that we're going to have a chance for later. Again, my gratitude to everyone who's made my visit here possible. I feel really fortunate to have this chance to be here for TAGS, as well as for the Center for Southeast Asia Studies Friday Forum. Tiantian has already mentioned this, but one of the themes for the conference this year, of course, is Glocal. This is a term that's gained some currency in social science circles to describe phenomena that lie at the intersection of the local and the global. Sometimes this term has been wielded to break down distinctions or kind of conventional binary between globalization or localization, or even the barrier between the universal and the particular. What I'll be focusing on, bitexts from Southeast Asia, which are sort of bilingual compositions that bring together cosmopolitan and vernacular elements, they're also doing this work of glocalization. They're bidirectional in the global sense. They simultaneously reach beyond to connect with classical South Asian languages and reach within to enrich the scope of vernacular Southeast Asian languages. So working from this Glocal perspective, it was not a term that I had thought of before I was invited to this conference, so I'm really happy to have a chance to think with this term with all of you. I'd like to propose 3 angles on bitexts that shed light on contemporary Southeast Asian contributions to some key debates in literary and translation studies. The first concerns the technological history of translation, which is particularly relevant now as we think about what's happening with machine translation, the kinds of large language models that have transformed what translation is today and what will be in the very near future. One thing that I'll be talking about a little bit more at the end of the talk is thinking about how modern methods of machine translation, whether they're statistical or neural, are based on bilingual corpora that in that field are known as bitexts. And this is where I'm drawing this term, in which one language, passages in one language are aligned, are connected to in some way with passages in another. And as I'll explain, this has some obvious parallels with what's happening in the early modern context for Indic vernacular bitexts in mainland Southeast Asia. And from my point of view, bitexts in Southeast Asia as a translation technology foreshadow some of the ways that machine translation approaches are transforming our world today. The second debate concerns the fate of classical languages in the early modern world. One question that always surfaces for me is when and how and why did the centuries-long and sometimes millennia-long discourses in languages like Arabic, Persian, Greek, Latin, Literary Sinitic, Pali, Sanskrit, etc., give way to vernacular forms? In some cases, that is a process that's still ongoing. So here I'm engaging a set of conversations in global literary studies that were really sparked by Sheldon Pollock's work, The Language of the Gods and the World of Men. And in that work, Pollock argues that the cosmopolitan language of Sanskrit in the South and Southeast Asian context and Latin in the European context form distinct political and linguistic orders in the first millennium. And this work has been engaged in a number of recent works that have been particularly inspiring to me in East Asian studies. So 2 works that sort of come to mind are Peter Kranitzky's Language Scripts, Chinese Texts in East Asia, also Ross King's edited volume, Cosmopolitan and Vernacular in the World of One. There's also an influential book for me by Kim Woon-kyol on literary Sinitic in East Asia. And all of these have demonstrated for me the persistence of a sinographic cosmopolis through much of the second millennium, including the early modern period in Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. By the same token, Indic vernacular bitexts in mainland Southeast Asia evince how writing in Pali and in bilingual Pali vernacular forms continue to thrive in the early modern period. And this challenges some of the periodization presented by Pollock and others. So that's one theme that I'll return to. The third debate that I'd like to engage here, this stems from another dimension of Pollock's thesis, namely the collapse of the Sanskrit and Latin religio-political linguistic orders at the end of the first millennium gave rise at the beginning of the second millennium to new vernacular worlds. And in other words, the very formation of vernacular languages in a certain sense could be tied to the decline of classical forms. This has probably been the most fiercely contested dimension of Pollack's ideas, as there's many counterexamples in Europe as well as in South Asia that show how certain vernacular literatures that undergirded political ideologies appeared in much earlier periods. In the Southeast Asian context, debates over the origins of vernacular literatures, to me, have long been siloed within certain kinds of nationalist frameworks that emerged particularly during the colonial period. But if we take a more pan-regional view, when and how did particular forms of written vernacular language emerge in written literature emerge in second millennium Southeast Asia? What was their relationship to the classical forms that had appeared in the first millennium? And again, as I'll talk about more, I think Pali vernacular and Sanskrit vernacular bitexts are key to answering this question. They're essential to understanding the formations of a number of key religious genres, such as doctrinal exegesis, narrative prose sermons, Buddhist court poetry. At the same time, these very forms of Indic vernacular compositions appear in most forms of technical literature from mainland Southeast Asia in the early modern period, including that used to record legal codes, medical manuals, treatises on grammar and prosody, and more. Even literature that's largely performed in an oral context and ritual settings often includes bitextual passages. So from that perspective, they're not just a means for preserving classical learning in the early modern period. They made certain kinds of new vernacular genres possible. So I will return to these themes at the end of my talk. I now want to dive in somewhat more specificity to what are Indic vernacular bitexts in the Southeast Asian context, how do they work, and point out two particular historical moments, one from the 1930s to the 1960s, and another from in the first part of the 17th century that shed light on the importance of these genres, what they were doing in particular historical periods, and how to think about them in this broader perspective. What's happening at the local level, what's happening at the global level. So if you'll indulge me, I will move into this second part. The basics of what I'm going to say are on this slide, so if you feel that, I've had enough, feel free to read the slide and head off. Is there anything I can do to improve sound or anything? All set? Okay. I presume all of you can hear me over there, and I presume it's online, it's working as well? Okay, awesome. So the first part of what I'll say is that this particular period, the early modern period, was the intellectual life in mainland Southeast Asia and particular kinds of pan-regional exchange in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Myanmar, certain parts of Yunnan and Vietnam, were predicated on this specific technology of reading translation, the Indic vernacular bitext, that acts in this local kind of way. Please. Oh, I see. Thank you so much. Thanks for catching me. Then I'll talk about these two historical periods that I highlighted, and then I'll return to these broader questions of why Southeast Asian bitexts deserve a place in the global history of translation and what kind of relevance they have for other medieval and early modern approaches to interacting with classical texts and classical languages. So these are the things that I will go through. Let me jump into them now. The first thing, as I begin to talk about definitions, techniques, histories for bitexts, is that the examples that I'm going to raise, I'm going to move through some of these slides pretty quickly, and bitexts are complex. The evidence that I'm using to make my arguments are complex in multiple dimensions, and this I'm sort of offering as a kind of invitation for how to think about what I'm sharing with you. That is, not all of the examples I might share are in languages that you might be familiar with. How to make sense of what's happening in these texts. So here's some things that I might suggest you might look at. So Are there examples of nonlinear reading strategies? What does that mean? What is the ways in which there is a kind of interaction being structured between vernacular or local or spoken languages and those we might frame as classical or cosmopolitan, scriptural, etc.? What are the kinds of linguistic differences that show up, and how are they marked in a topological kind of format through strategies of annotation or the layout on the page? Also, we can think about when I show an image of a manuscript, like we have a section of a manuscript down below here, how to think about this as a workbench, as a site of active engagement by a reader, by an exegete, by a translator, by a preacher, a performer, etc. And then I think most importantly, and why I'm particularly happy to share in the context of the TAGS conference as well as for the Friday Forum, is what kinds of cross-linguistic, cross-regional parallels to your own spheres of expertise are you seeing? What kinds of things are you being curious about? So I invite your mind to wander. Don't feel you need to follow everything I'm saying. This is also a way of me excusing myself if my talk is not as clear as it should be. But I think there's a lot of intellectual value in your wandering as you listen. So let me begin with that. What are bitexts? The definition that I'm using here, again drawing from corpus linguistics, is that a bitext is a bilingual presentation of a text that includes both the source text in one language and its translation into another. And as I mentioned at the beginning, the key principle here is that of alignment. That is, the two languages are entangled in some way. They are aligned in some way, whether for a human reader or a human listener to understand, or in the case of machine translation, for a computer to understand the relationship between parallel passages in these different languages. In the more specific context that I'll be engaging here, an Indic vernacular bitext is a bilingual presentation of text that comprises one, an Indic prestige language. I won't be sharing Sanskrit examples, but there are Sanskrit examples. I'll be mostly focusing on examples where the classical language involved is Pali, and a local vernacular, typically in an interphrasal, that is phrase by phrase, word by word, sentence by sentence, etc., or an interlinear format. And here are just some examples on the bottom. For instance, on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a excerpt of an interphrasal Pali-Siamese text. So in red, in this particular script known as Kamya script, this portion of the text is in Pali. And in the portion in black, in a particular script used in the Ayutthaya period in Thailand called Thaya script, this script is in Thai or Siamese. On the right, we also see a different way of presenting a bitext, one that's interlinear. That is, every other line is alternating between the languages. And here we have carved into the palm leaf. This whole manuscript is actually only about 5 centimeters high. We have the root text in Pali being carved into the leaf. And then above and below that, and the letters are just about 2 to 3 millimeters high here, we have annotations in the Lao language, in the Tam Lao script, that are providing a way of reading what's happening. So I'll be giving some examples of these two different modes of bitexts in Southeast Asia. I won't talk so much about the particular techniques that are used. There's this quite specific and regionally shared set of techniques that are used to generate these bitexts, that are used to read classical languages in the vernacular, that are used to analyze what's happening in a classical text and present it anew in the vernacular, and to present it in a particular way for a particular kind of audience. So the examples that I'll bring up will see some dimensions of parsing, amplification, rearrangement, annotation, gloss, etc. But I won't be focusing on those specifics. Rather, the examples I'll bring up will try to get at some of these broader themes. But if you're interested, I'm always happy to talk more about the technical details of what's happening in this interaction between languages. There are many different local terms to describe bitexts in South and Southeast Asia. There is no one single term that's shared across the region. The closest thing to a pan-regional term is this word that's most often used in a Burmese context, Nisya. But there are, again, a whole bunch of other terms used. And these terms tend to highlight particular techniques that is the way in which a bytext is being created, or the function of that text. Is it a support for reading, or is it designed to be a script for oral performance? All those kinds of clues can be seen within the emic terms that are used to describe these compositions. There is a variety of ways to think about the historical sweep of bytext across the first and especially second millennium. These are just some examples of the earliest evidence that I've been able to find for this kind of reading and writing in mainland Southeast Asia and also in Sri Lanka. And the periods that I'll be focusing on today are, again, the beginning, the end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, and also the middle part of the 20th century. It's two particularly consequential periods for the history of these forms. But of course, I'm leaving out a broader body of evidence to think about this longer sweep of history. Let me guide you through a couple examples here in the, first I'll begin with an interlinear example, and then into an phrasal one, just so you can get a sense of how these kinds of compositions work. So this you see here is very much similar to that example I showed down here, except that the language and the color of the annotations are different. This was an important curricular text for monastics between the 16th and 19th century. It actually has continued to be an important curricular text for Theravada monastics up to the present. That is the Dhammapada Akataka. And the main text, again, is inscribed into the palm leaf itself, and then someone has very carefully, again with letter heights of about 2 millimeters, created these annotations using, in some cases, some special symbols, codes, abbreviations in order to present a complete vernacular translation of this text, but in a very efficient way. So if one was to transliterate what's going on here, we would see on the top half of the slide that the main text here in plain script, plain Roman type, is the root Pali text, and then what I've put in bold above and below are different kinds of glosses, sometimes into Pali, sometimes into the vernacular language, in this case Siamese, as well as different numbers or letters that show exactly how one is supposed to rearrange a Pali sentence or add other words to that Pali sentence to be able to translate it in a very faithful way into the vernacular. So again, looking at it this way, it looks quite confusing, but what it is a cue for someone reading this is a fluent vernacular version of this text. If we were to look at an interphrasal example, some of the same steps appear, even though what it looks like visually on the page is quite different. So this is an example of a Pali Siamese bytext that happens to be preserved in a Cambodian monastery. If we take just the cited passage here, this opening to a Buddhist text, Evam Suttam, that's what I heard, it goes through these various processes of analysis before the final reading is determined. It's parsed, it's divided into different words, it's amplified. Other Pali words are added that are not part of the root text. It's, if it was done in an interlinear way, it would be rearranged using this particular system of numbers and or letters. Then we could simply translate into English. We could understand the Pali in a certain way, but what happens in this particular manuscript is that it's annotated in Thai, and we with the first step of adding just certain grammatical particles, often which are not necessarily in vernacular Thai, but are used to provide a very precise translation of what's happening in the Pali. And oftentimes, the translation the bytext is only done at this stage is not always added, because it might be obvious for a reader. It's not necessarily to add the gloss, it may be sufficient simply to add the vernacular grammatical particles. But at the very end, we're left with a fluent vernacular translation that maintains the original embedded within it. So these are two different ways of structuring bytext. The other examples that I'm going to bring up will work with these two basic kinds of structuring principles. I'd now like to move on to this second part where I'll talk about two different periods. The first period I'll talk about is the middle of the 20th century. This is, in some case, the end of the use of bitexts on a widespread scale in mainland Southeast Asia, but it was also a period in which bitexts were being experimented with in new ways. And then I'll move on to the second part that deals with the early part of the 17th century. So the examples that I'll bring up now are from Cambodia, from Vietnam, and from Shan State and Myanmar. And each of them show different ways of how bitexts during this period had a particular effect on how Buddhist modes of reading, writing, and translation were taking place. The Pali Khmer or Pali Khmer examples that I'll focus on show the way that a more streamlined style of bilingual translation put in, forgive me, it's okay if I close that one, okay. This one too, wonderful. Were an extremely important step in the development of the fully vernacular Khmer language version of the Tipitaka, or the Theravada Buddhist scriptures. So I'll show one bit of how that process took place. We also see bitexts as a stepping stone that was experimented with briefly in the Vietnamese context as well as the Shan context in the middle of the 20th century, but later were not taken on as a key mode of writing going forward. Before I get into this Khmer example, the Khmer examples I'm showing you are sutta openings, that is, they're the beginning of a Buddhist text, in this case used in a sermon context. This is an example from the middle of the 19th century in Lan Na or northern Thailand. Looking at the translation of what was on the previous slide, we see that this simple phrase again, "thus have I heard," is expanded in a certain way in this bilingual version. And the second paragraph here just shows how extensively this phrase is commented upon. It's commented on a way that draws from the Pali commentaries, but also is distinct to the way that Pali vernacular bitexts in Southeast Asia in the 19th century were composed. If we look to this more transitional period from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, we see that there's a streamlining of how bitexts were being composed. So here, if we look at the top, "thus have I heard," this is the portion in Pali, then we have this vernacular gloss and expansion that follows. This Giriman, the sutta, is what I, Ananda, heard in the presence of the fortunate one by means of listening to it just once and committing it to memory, is less expanded than before, but is still going beyond the very strict sense of the meaning. What we see emerging in the 1920s and into the 1930s, and this is a process for the context of which I would certainly encourage you to read Anne Hansen's wonderful book, How to Behave, in which we see that early modernist Buddhist thinkers in Cambodia came up with a way of maintaining this bitextual legacy, but cutting away the elements of elaboration so that just the bare meaning is left. And so that's what we have shown at this example. "Thus have I heard," and then put in parentheses in the original the parts that are not actually part of the root text, such that there's a very clear and precise translation of what's going on. And it is this precise style that became the basis for the Cambodian Tipitaka, which is one of the very first complete vernacular language versions of the Pali scriptures ever done in Southeast Asia. We see similar uses of bitexts in the importation of Khmer forms of Theravada Buddhism, Khmer modernist forms of Theravada Buddhism in southern Vietnam. This is a process that took place led by a Vietnamese monastic named Ho Bong that took place from the 1940s to the early 1960s. And in translating Cambodian modernist thinkers, their Khmer and Pali Khmer language works into Vietnamese, Ho Bong and his contemporaries occasionally brought this bitextual style in. But this was an experiment, it didn't last very long, and subsequent versions of Theravada texts in the Vietnamese context, this is among ethnic Vietnamese speakers in Vietnam, rather than among the Kampuchea Kram people in Vietnam, tended to move towards a strictly Vietnamese-only approach to handling these texts. In other words, the bitextual period lasted for a very brief moment. We also see, this is just another example, the charts that I'm giving here is just one way to try to visualize what's happening in a bitext like this. We have a sequence of Pali words in the original. A certain subset of those are selected to be put into the bitext. Other Pali words might be added for context, and then in between that, in this quite aligned and intertwined way, we see the vernacular coming through. An analogous set of experiments also took place in Myanmar, in the Shan state. Shan Buddhist manuscripts up to this point were primarily not in this particular bitextual style. In other words, they might incorporate certain Pali phrases at the beginning, might incorporate a lot of Burmese vocabulary, etc., but the rather more technical approach to bitext was not used as widely in Shan context. One Shan intellectual, U Banya Bahuka, attempted a very ambitious project to translate the entire Tipitaka into this Pali Shan bitextual form. This is one of these early examples of his work here, working on the Mangala Sutta. And one thing you can see in the image is that certain aspects of his translation style became controversial for later generations of Shan scholars. So the printed text is in black, and then a later Shan scholar has annotated this and crossed out or replaced all the words of Burmese origin. So this is a style in the Shan context that came from a Burmese model. Here we have a later Shan scholar trying to remove these traces of Burmese influence, these Burmese vocabulary words, grammatical terms, etc., such that it can be could fit a certain notion of what Shan literature meant in the second half of the 20th century. And again, even this is, again, for this very simple phrase, thus have I heard, we see it expanded in a quite complex way. So just to focus on the chart on the bottom, those three words, evam, thus, me, by me, sutang, heard, 1, 2, 3, are reordered in a certain way. And then all of the letters A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. This is a way of representing all of these other Pali words that have been inserted into the bitext, not part of the original text, inserted to create a reading that will work in Shan. And then the dots above show all the different Shan words that have been added to create this very tightly linked form of a Pali Shan bitext. This was, in a sense, one of the last and most significant experiments around new kinds of bitextual writing that took place in Southeast Asia. After this period, if we think about the second half of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, certain forms of bitext continued to be used in some forms of monastic study, particularly in Myanmar, as well as in performed bitextual sermons in Lao, Thai, Khun, Cambodian context, etc. But we see fewer and fewer compositions from this period in the bitextual format. What if we turn back to the very early period, however, when bitexts were relatively new, when they were still emerging, and new genres of new ways of writing in the bitextual format were just emerging? What would we see? So here I want to focus on some examples from this relatively early period. And the evidence I'll draw on is all from manuscripts that are reliably dated to this period from the beginning of the 17th century. Some will be, the first one will draw on an interlinear approach and the way that bitext could be used for philological study during this period. I'll then show an example of bitext being used in an exegetical context for engaging in scriptural commentary and exegesis, though I won't be showing examples of it, but this is also the particular forms that made their way into so-called non-Buddhist genres like law, medicine, grammar, etc., though of course within the framework of these manuscript cultures, these would be still transmitted within a Buddhist context. And then the last example that I'll bring out is the form of bitexts that end up being used in narrative sermons. And this is actually the very earliest example that survives in manuscript form of a narrative sermon being composed in a bitextual format that dates from 1606 in Laos. So the first example I'll bring here will be another interlinear form. This happens to be the very earliest interlinear bitext that I've been able to find in Southeast Asia. One of the reasons why it may be particularly old is that the annotations are inscribed rather than inked. There may have been, of course, earlier texts earlier manuscripts that still survive to the present, but because they were inked, the ink has wiped off over time, and we can no longer see how people were reading in this bilingual way. But because the annotations here were carved, they've been preserved. So this particular one dates from the beginning of the 17th century, and probably from the reign of Atitya in the mid-Ayutthaya period. And if we were to transliterate it, again, we see this very complex array of the root text. This is a Pali grammatical text here. Both Pali and Thai language annotations, and then a complex set of numbers that show how to reorder this sentence to read it in the vernacular. And again, there's a number of issues of abbreviation that are taking place here, which is very common to versions of bitext that are used for philological or exegetical purposes. That is, the translation that's given might be very, very skeletal, or only hint at the translation. Anything that was deemed to be obvious or self-evident to the person creating the bitext wouldn't necessarily be rendered into the vernacular. The reader has to supply all this extra material themselves. So it's a very active kind of reading process. So again, if we just to translate in a very strict way what's going on, we see certain kinds of grammatical particles showing the use of a nominative case or the ablative case. We have glosses into Pali as well as into Thai, and this system of syntactic rearrangement. So the sequence in the manuscript as we read it is 3, 6, 4, 5, 7, 8, 9, 2, 10, 1, and then 11 is implied, 12, and then there's 2 that are labeled as 13, so one we have to take is 13b and one is 13a, 14 and 15. The ones that are in italics are the ones that are not part of the root text. The ones that are in plain Roman script are part of the root text. But in the way that this would actually be read and engaged, it appears in a linear sequence. And the vernacular reading that's generated is one that's quite rule-bound. It follows these specific conventions. Not all of the words are translated. Sometimes just a grammatical particle is given, but it creates a way of understanding how a text like this would have been approached in the period. We see also certain ways in which Pali words are given a Sanskrit gloss in Thai, and this is part of a broader principle of how Sanskrit influenced phonologies of certain Indic words made their way into Thai at this period. The next example that I'll bring up is a exegetical one. So the first one that I showed you was really meant more in a philological context, a context of studying language. What about in a context where the author of a bitext is trying to show, well, this is my understanding, this is my interpretation of this given text. How might they use these techniques to create this exegetical form? So the manuscript that I'm using here, this particular one has a quite complex history that sort of can be traced all across mainland Southeast Asia, and that it was the scribe noted that they had transliterated it or translated it. The terminology here is not clear, from a Lao script example. Lao in this period could refer to Lao or Lan Na. And there's some evidence as I read through this text that it's probably based ultimately on a now lost Burmese exemplar. Because the exegetical style that's used, it's one that was quite significant during this period in Burma, but not as much followed in Cambodia, Thailand, Laos. To add to the complexity of this text, it's for at least the past 150 years, it's been taken care of in Cambodia. Today it's part of the Royal Palace collection, even though the language of the text is in Pali and Thai. The particular exegetical style here of this text, this is a commentary on the monastic code, comprises a series of quite strictly followed steps. So one, there's a quotation of a root text, then this bitextual unpacking done in this Burmese style known as Nisiya, and then there's a complete vernacular explanation of that unpacked passage. And then, very curiously, the author at each turn adds a mnemonic verse, a verse that's easy to memorize, that is not found in any other kind of commentary, but one that was composed specifically in Southeast Asia to deal with one aspect of the root passage. In other words, the author is not content to let their commentaries and explanations in either a bilingual style or in a fully vernacular style be the last word for how they understand this text. They also have to add a verse in Pali. That verse is then subject to the same kind of bitextual unpacking, and then finally a vernacular explanation. And those steps might repeat as many as 20 times for a given short passage of the root text, and then we move on to the next passage. And this same exegetical process in quite painstaking detail continues through all 1,000 pages of this manuscript. So just to give you a sense of how this particular style worked. On top is an image of this particular passage of the manuscript in a form of conscript used in the middle of the Ayutthaya period. We have first the abbreviated quotation of the original monastic rule. It's not given in full. This is a full paragraph length rule, but the reader was thought to have already have memorized this text. This is, of course, the monastic code that monastics in the Theravada tradition are expected to memorize, so there was no need for the Bitexts to provide it in full. It could provide it in a very abbreviated form. But then it's given this quite complex bitextual exegesis, including a number of other portions that are added. Some of these conform to existing commentarial traditions, some of them are new exegetical moves by the author of the Bitexts. Then we have a complete vernacular version that shows from another point of view how to understand this passage. Then the mnemonic verse that I mentioned. The mnemonic verses in this text are a rather unusual form of Pali that doesn't always conform with the grammatical expectations of Pali composed in South Asia, but is quite familiar to how Pali was composed in Southeast Asia during this period. And then finally, we have a bitextual unpacking of that mnemonic verse, which is completely essential because the verses themselves are often in a highly cryptic and compressed form that requires this bitextual unpacking to simply be able to understand what's going on. Then this is followed by a vernacular explanation, and finally, because some other issue inevitably arises in the course of that vernacular explanation, it requires another mnemonic verse, and this process goes on and on and on throughout the manuscript. So this is, again, one way in which these exegetical concepts were worked through in bitextual format in this period. The last example is one that I will, for interest of time, I will not go through in detail. Feel free to ask me about it later. But during this very same period, not only were bitexts pioneered for philological and exegetical ends, but they also began to be used in narrative sermons. And the very earliest example of such a narrative sermon to survive in a bitextual style comes from Laos. The colophon indicates that this was written in 1606 of the Common Era. And this particular text here is composed of a number of different narratives, all of which would be appropriate for a sermon. What's perhaps most distinctive in what's going on here is that there is no original Pali root text. There's only the Pali as it exists in the Bitext, and the way it exists in the Bitext is not complete. It is only where the author of the Bitext felt it necessary to include Pali. And the places where Pali is included follows a set of stereotype forms that dominated the composition of bilingual sermons from the 17th century all the way up to the end of the 19th century. We see very similar kinds of approaches used. That is, Pali is used abundantly in the beginning with a quote indicating the frame narrative. Then we have an unpacking of that frame. And then we see it emphasized in as the spoken language, so that the audience of the narrative sermon always can understand and appreciate that anybody speaking in this text, even though the sermon is being given to Lao speakers in Laos, is understood to take place in this timeless, placeless realm of Pali. In other words, everybody has to speak Pali. So all of the spoken sections always have what people are saying in Pali, sometimes in a prose portion, as we see here, sometimes in a verse portion, as we see here. So this, again, is the style that went on to dominate how sermons were given in mainland Southeast Asia from the 17th through the end of the 19th centuries. What I'd like to do in the 10 minutes I have left is return back to some of the broader themes that I mentioned at the beginning. And now that I've given you a chance to think through these examples, to explore what you might be thinking about in the context of these examples, what they bring up for you, how they might relate to particular issues that you've been wondering about in your work, I'd like to tie it back to those three debates that I mentioned in the beginning. The debate around the technological history of translation, around the fate of classical languages in the early modern world, and the emergence of vernacular forms of literature in early modern Southeast Asia. Before I begin with this last section, can I just quickly check the time?
12:51.
12:51. Should I go until 1? Is that about good timing? Okay. And I won't bore you all to tears if I do this last section. Okay.
Yeah, so you're good.
I will go ahead with this.
You're good.
Thanks for your indulgence. So, a key problem in corpus linguistics, as I mentioned at the beginning, and also in machine translation, is how to align texts in one language with their translation to another. In order to create a training model, one has to develop a huge bitextual compora for each of the necessary language pairs. So if we have a set of texts in English and along with their translation into Marathi, that might not be enough to train a statistical or even a neural model for machine translation. We need a way to connect each English unit of text with its equivalent in Marathi. And this task of connecting across bitextual corpora is what is known as bitextual alignment in that field. So without alignment, machine translation is not possible. And there's lots of challenges that are associated with this. I won't go into them now, but alignment on the one level needs to cope with the kinds of large-scale structural differences between languages, as well as the often quite different syntax that is happening between different pairs, like we think about English and Japanese, or between Thai and Sanskrit. There are many quite different ways that languages might be structured. How can we come up with a way that aligns, that entangles the languages to a sufficiently close degree such that a human, or in the case of machine translation, an algorithm can be able to understand how to align what's going on. From my point of view, early modern Indian vernacular bitexts from mainland Southeast Asia rely on some of the same principles and also conundrums of alignment that we see in machine translation. We also sometimes see in literary publishing, in linguistic analysis, language pedagogy. The diverse techniques of presentation, like the different ways in which a manuscript might be crafted for use in grammatical instruction or to give a sermon, doesn't necessarily detract from this key principle of alignment. No matter how the bitext is structured, it's necessary to show whether through techniques of mise en page, through using reordered sequences, markup in the form of specialized symbols, numbers, particles, extended glosses, etc., the relationship between the two languages. So from that point of view, bitexts are a kind of early modern technology of alignment, a kind of metadata wrapper, as it were, that binds together a collection or a composition in two languages and allows those languages to talk to one another in a certain way. Of course, they're not the ancestors in some kind of teleological sense to what's happening in machine translation, but they sometimes represent analogous solutions to similar kinds of problems. How to present a source text and a target text simultaneously, how to maintain a rigorous set of reference points between linking translated words and their sources, etc. The second set of debates that I want to turn to is that around reading classical languages in the early modern world. So here I'm thinking through work by David Lurie, Alexander Beecroft, Kim Bung-kyo, Ross King, among others, who have remarked, particularly in their responses to Pollock's work, the cosmopolitan vernacular distinction that he posits for South Asia and Europe is really harder to fit into medieval and early modern East Asia. So within the cenographic cosmopolis of China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, literary Sinitic, of course, remained a key language of politics and literature up through the modern period. It was not simply supplanted by national vernaculars until perhaps the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Literary texts in vernaculars did flourish in certain parts of East Asia, particularly in Japan, for instance, from the medieval period onward, but not necessarily at the expense of literary Sinitic. And this is, again, quite in contrast to the model that Pollock offers for South Asia. In the Theravada world, Pali was never a language of political power on par with Sanskrit, but its prestige in both religious and temporal spheres meant that it remained current as a language of the law, diplomacy, and erudition up to the onset of the colonial period. We can see some analogous cases to the function of Latin in the early modern period until it was eventually supplanted, say, for diplomacy and science by French and later by English. What factors, though, explain why classical languages persisted? Why did Latin and Pali, Sanskrit, literary Sinitic continue to be used into the 17th and even 18th centuries? So there's many explanations for this phenomenon. I think an underappreciated factor is the role of classical vernacular bitexts. And this we see across Europe and East Asia, as well as in the Southeast Asian examples that I was sharing with you today. A key technique here is one that John Whitman would call vernacular reading. This is a term that gets later adopted and expanded by Krenitsky. Both of them are referring to the ways that Japanese, Korean, and Vietnamese ways of reading literary Sinitic in ways that hew to local phonology, syntax, grammar, lexicon, etc. So one particularly prominent example of this is the Japanese system of Kanbun Kundoku, which in some ways is quite different than the examples I've brought up here, but there are some striking similarities in that it offers an interlinear annotation system of grammatical analysis in syntactic rearrangement, and also a reading practice for transforming literary Sinitic into a distinct form of Japanese prose. And indeed, that very distinct form of Japanese prose, the prose that develops out of a vernacular reading of literary Sinitic, is one that proved to be quite influential in the Japanese context. Again, I won't bring up these examples, but there's some evidence in the medieval European context that the development of early vernaculars in Western Europe, Frisian, different kinds of other Germanic language, Old English, Old Irish, we see in their first emergence, in many cases, is in Latin manuscripts in the form of so-called paving letters to show how the Latin should be rearranged to be read in Old English or Old Irish, for how to gloss certain words into the vernacular, etc. So for me, contra the assertions of Lurie, the continued use of classical Chinese in the early modern East Asia is not necessarily tied to the distinctive features of cenographic writing. Rather, we can see it as part of a broader pattern in the early modern world of continued forms of bitextual vernacular reading practices. The last set of issues that I'd like to bring out here as I close deal with the emergence of vernacular literature in early modern Southeast Asia. And here, I'll just highlight a couple of points that I think are most important. One is that some of the earliest pieces of evidence for written literary works in the mainland Southeast Asian context appear in bitextual forms. We also see that some of those works prove particularly influential. So if we think about the Thai context, the Mahatha Kamluang, which a later chronicle dates to 1482, and some of the literary dimension of that text, at least in certain chapters, suggests that it was indeed composed in the early Ayutthaya period, at least certain parts of it, proved to be one kind of bitextual form, in this case a Pali-Siamese form, that was influenced generations of writers in that context. Similarly, if we look to the Northern Thai context, the earliest manuscripts that have any Lamna or vernacular Northern Thai portions at all to survive are exclusively bitextual sermons and exegetical treatises from the middle of the 16th century onward. The same goes for the Lao, Burmese, and Mon sources. So does that mean that that really Bitexts played a key role in the creation of written Southeast Asian literature in the early modern period? If we think about Pollock's model of the vernacular millennium, local vernaculars replace the cosmopolitan language entirely, but mimic its political status and its prestige. But here we have, in the East Asian context, as well as in the Southeast Asian context, the continued use of a cosmopolitan language like literary Sinitic or Pali up through the early modern period. And certain forms of writing were not influenced by what was happening in bitextual forms, but other forms, particularly in the Theravada world, the evidence tilts in favor of bitexts. Pali-Siamese and Pali-Lana poems, for instance, are among the earliest local compositions to survive, and their skillful mirroring of Indic verse structures and the vernacular proved influential for generations of poets. In the case of literary prose, Indic vernacular bitexts is even more clear. Key genres that I've gone through, like literary sermons, manuals of grammar and prosody, legal, compendia, etc., were initially structured as bitexts. Fully vernacular versions of these forms didn't appear, in many cases, until the beginning of the 20th century. The global processes, in other words, that made the bitext so successful in the Southeast Asian context simultaneously supported the continuation of classical learning and, on the other hand, the development of vernacular literature. We also, as I noted, in this period of the middle of the 20th century, we have a period in which bitexts are beginning to slip away from view and influence in mainland Southeast Asia. We also have some new experiments that are taking place, say in the Shan or the Vietnamese context, or putting bitexts to a different kind of use in the Cambodian context. These happen to be abandoned experiments. And we might say then that the bitextual age, as it were, in mainland Southeast Asia lasted from the end of the Sanskrit cosmopolis in the 14th century, really through the end of, and lasted to the end of the 19th century. And during this period in which Pali scholarship thrived alongside the formation of new vernacular genres, the global, or rather in this case, Glocal technology of the bitext was a crucial fulcrum between the universalizing aesthetics of Pali and the particularities of individual Southeast Asian languages and cultures. As a technology of translation and alignment, the bitext thrived in a period of increasing global trade and communication. Along with parallel developments, some of which I've only really gestured to here, in Europe, East Asia, and beyond, Indic vernacular bitexts in mainland Southeast Asia prefigure solutions to some of the fundamental issues around language to which we turn to AI-driven machine translation today. So thank you so much for your patience with me, and sorry for going long.